Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly horrifying. A pharaoh so hated by his own people that when they finally killed him, they didn't just murder him, they literally ate him alive, piece by piece, in one of the most gruesome acts of revenge in human history. We're diving into the story of the most brutal royal assassination in ancient Egypt, where a king's reign of terror ended with his own subjects turning into cannibals and devouring their ruler while he was still breathing. Forget the dignified deaths of pharaohs, Hollywood sold you. The truth is, some Egyptian kings met ends so horrific that the details were deliberately erased from history to prevent copycat revolts. So before we cross into the ancient world, take a moment to like this video, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and subscribe if you'd like to join me on more journeys through history. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in tonight, and what time zone is keeping you company. There's something both fascinating and disturbing about how these stories of ultimate revenge unite us across time and distance. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1323 BCE, and you're witnessing the final moments of one of Egypt's most despised rulers. The palace is in chaos. The guards have abandoned their posts, and an angry mob of nobles, priests and commoners has cornered the pharaoh in his private chambers. But this isn't going to be a quick execution. This is going to be something far more personal, far more savage, and far more terrifying than anything you could imagine. The pharaoh in question was Akhenaten's immediate successor, a ruler whose name was so thoroughly erased from Egyptian records that we still don't know his true identity with certainty. Some scholars believe it was Sementkara, others think it was Nefertiti, but what we do know from fragmentary accounts and archaeological evidence is that this ruler's reign was marked by such cruelty, corruption and religious extremism that it drove the Egyptian people to unprecedented acts of violence. The story begins in the aftermath of Akhenaten's death, when Egypt was struggling to recover from the chaos of the Amarna period. The traditional gods had been banned, the economy was in ruins, and the military was weakened by years of neglect. Into this power vacuum stepped a ruler who promised to restore order, but instead made everything infinitely worse. Where Akhenaten had simply banned the old gods, the Cannibal King actively persecuted their followers. Temples were not just closed but destroyed, priests were not just dismissed but executed, and anyone caught practicing the traditional religion was subjected to horrific punishments. The persecution extended beyond religion into every aspect of Egyptian life. The Cannibal King imposed crushing taxes to fund his building projects and military campaigns, but instead of using the money for the benefit of Egypt, he spent it on personal luxuries and monuments to his own glory. Entire villages were emptied to provide workers for his projects, and those who couldn't work were simply left to starve. He reportedly enjoyed watching executions and torture sessions, often ordering increasingly creative and painful methods of death for those who displeased him. Public floggings became entertainment events, and the king would personally participate in the torture of prisoners, taking sadistic pleasure in their suffering. The breaking point came when the Cannibal King ordered the execution of the high priest of Amun, the most respected religious leader in Egypt. But this wasn't to be a simple execution. The king ordered that the priest be slowly dismembered while still alive, with each piece of his body fed to wild animals while he watched. The priest's family was forced to witness this horror, and then they too were killed in equally gruesome fashion. This act of unprecedented sacrilege and cruelty finally pushed the Egyptian people beyond their breaking point. The nobles, who had been quietly plotting against the king for months, decided that the time for subtle political maneuvering was over. They began reaching out to military commanders, religious leaders, and even common citizens, building a coalition united by their shared hatred of the tyrant king. The conspiracy that emerged was unlike anything in Egyptian history. It wasn't just a palace coup or a military rebellion, it was a popular uprising that crossed all social boundaries. Nobles worked alongside farmers, priests collaborated with soldiers, and even the king's own servants joined the plot to bring down their master. They wanted him to suffer as he had made others suffer. They wanted him to experience the same terror and agony that he had inflicted on countless victims, and they wanted to send a message to any future ruler who might consider following in his footsteps. The opportunity came during the festival of Opade, when the king was required to appear in public for religious ceremonies. The conspirators had spent weeks preparing, positioning their people throughout the crowd and ensuring that every escape route was blocked. When the king appeared on his golden throne, carried by his bearers through the streets of Thebes, he had no idea that he was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. The attack began subtly. At first it seemed like nothing more than an unusually hostile crowd. People were shouting insults and throwing objects. But this wasn't entirely unusual for an unpopular ruler. The king's guards were alert but not overly concerned. They had dealt with angry crowds before, but then the shouting became more organized, more focused. The crowd began chanting specific accusations against the king, listing his crimes in detail. The throwing of objects became more targeted and more violent, and suddenly the guards realized that this wasn't just an angry crowd. This was a coordinated attack. The first guards to fall were taken completely by surprise. They had been watching the crowd in front of them, not realizing that conspirators had infiltrated their own ranks. Knives appeared from nowhere, striking down the king's protectors before they could even draw their weapons. Within minutes, the royal procession had turned into a battlefield. The king, still on his throne, watched in horror as his guards fell around him. He screamed for help, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. He tried to flee, but the bearers carrying his throne had already joined the conspiracy. Instead of carrying him to safety, they lowered the throne to the ground and stepped back, leaving their king defenseless in the middle of the mob. What happened next was so horrific that most historical accounts refuse to describe it in detail. The crowd didn't just kill the king, they tore him apart with their bare hands, but they didn't kill him quickly. They wanted him to suffer, to experience every moment of agony as his body was slowly destroyed. The first to reach the king were the nobles who had organized the conspiracy. They had planned this moment carefully, and they had specific roles to play. Some held the king down, while others began the grisly work of dismemberment. They started with his fingers and toes, cutting them off one by one while he screamed in agony. But the truly horrific part was what they did with the pieces they cut off. Instead of simply discarding them, they began to eat them. Right there, in front of the terrified and fascinated crowd, the nobles of Egypt began consuming their king while he was still alive to watch. In ancient Egyptian belief, consuming someone's flesh was thought to absorb their power and essence. By eating the king while he was still alive, the conspirators were symbolically taking back the power he had stolen from them, and the people of Egypt. As word of what was happening spread through the crowd, more and more people joined in the cannibalistic feast. Priests who had been persecuted by the king took bites of his flesh as revenge for their murdered colleagues. Farmers whose families had starved because of the king's taxes consumed pieces of his body as payment for their suffering. Even children were lifted up by their parents to take small bites of the dying tyrant. The king remained conscious through most of this ordeal, his screams echoing through the streets of Thebes as his own people literally devoured him alive. The conspirators had been careful to avoid vital organs and major blood vessels, ensuring that he would remain alive and aware for as long as possible. The psychological torture was as important as the physical torture. As each piece of his body was consumed, the crowd would chant the names of the king's victims, making sure he understood that this was justice for his crimes. They recited the details of his cruelties, forcing him to confront the full scope of his evil as his body was slowly destroyed. Even if anyone could have heard him, it was far too late for mercy. The people of Egypt had endured too much suffering, witnessed too much cruelty, and lost too many loved ones to the king's brutality. This was their moment of revenge, and they were going to savor every second of it. The cannibalistic feast continued for hours, with different groups taking turns to consume pieces of the king's body. The nobles ate first, as befitted their status, but they made sure that representatives from every social class had the opportunity to participate. Priests, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, and even slaves were all given the chance to take their revenge on the tyrant who had oppressed them. As the king's body was slowly consumed, his strength ebbed away, his screams became weaker, his struggles less violent. But the crowd showed no mercy, no compassion for his suffering. They had seen too much cruelty from this man to feel any pity for him now. The end came slowly and agonizingly. By the time the king finally died, there was little left of his body. The crowd had consumed almost everything, leaving only bones and a few scraps of flesh. Even his heart, the organ that Egyptians believed was necessary for the afterlife, was torn out and eaten while he watched, ensuring that he would have no chance of resurrection or eternal life. But the crowd's revenge didn't end with the king's death. They turned their attention to his supporters, his family members, and anyone who had benefited from his reign of terror. The palace was stormed and looted, with the king's treasures distributed among the people he had impoverished. His wives and children were killed, though mercifully they were given quick deaths rather than the prolonged agony their husband and father had endured. The king's monuments and statues were destroyed with the same savage enthusiasm that had characterized his death. Every image of him was defaced or demolished. Every inscription bearing his name was chiseled away, The Egyptians were determined to erase every trace of the Cannibal King from history, to ensure that future generations would never know his name or remember his crimes. The aftermath of the cannibalistic assassination was both liberating and traumatic for Egyptian society. On one hand, the people had finally freed themselves from a tyrant who had made their lives miserable. The oppressive laws were repealed, the persecuted priests were restored to their positions, and the traditional gods were welcomed back to their temples. But on the other hand, the brutality of the king's death had shocked even those who participated in it. Many of the conspirators were haunted by what they had done, struggling to reconcile their actions with their moral beliefs. The cannibalistic feast had been necessary, they told themselves, but it had also been deeply disturbing and traumatic. But Tutankhamun's advisors were determined to ensure that the horrific events of the Cannibal King's death would never be repeated. They implemented new laws and customs designed to prevent any future ruler from accumulating too much power or abusing their position. The story of the Cannibal King's death was deliberately suppressed and erased from official records. The scribes who recorded Egyptian history were ordered to omit any mention of the cannibalistic assassination, and the few accounts that did survive were hidden away in secret archives or destroyed entirely. But the memory of what had happened lived on in the oral traditions of the Egyptian people. Parents told their children about the king who was eaten alive by his own subjects, using the story as a warning about the dangers of tyranny and the importance of treating others with respect and compassion. The cannibalistic assassination also had profound effects on Egyptian religious and cultural practices. The act of consuming human flesh, even in the context of justified revenge, was deeply troubling to a society that placed great emphasis on the sanctity of the human body and the importance of proper burial rites. Priests and religious scholars spent years debating the theological implications of what had happened. Some argued that the cannibalistic feast was justified because the king had forfeited his humanity through his cruelty. Others maintained that the act was inherently evil, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. The debate eventually led to new religious teachings about the nature of justice and revenge. Egyptian theology developed more sophisticated concepts of divine justice and the proper ways to respond to tyranny and oppression. The idea that extreme circumstances might justify extreme actions became part of Egyptian moral philosophy, but with strict limitations and safeguards. The psychological impact of the cannibalistic assassination on the participants was severe and long-lasting. Many of those who had taken part in the feast reported nightmares and disturbing dreams for years afterward. Some became obsessed with purification rituals, desperately trying to cleanse themselves of what they saw as spiritual contamination. The trauma was particularly severe for the children who had been encouraged to participate in the cannibalistic feast. Many of them grew up with deep psychological scars, struggling with guilt and shame over their actions. Some became pacifists, refusing to engage in any form of violence for the rest of their lives. Others became obsessed with justice and revenge, dedicating their lives to hunting down and punishing wrongdoers. The traditional hierarchy and respect for authority were shaken by the realization that even a pharaoh could be brought down by popular uprising. Future rulers had to be much more careful about how they treated their subjects, knowing that extreme oppression could lead to extreme retaliation. The military implications of the cannibalistic assassination were equally significant. The fact that the king's own guards had joined the conspiracy sent shockwaves through the Egyptian military establishment. New protocols were developed for protecting the pharaoh with multiple layers of security and loyalty checks designed to prevent future betrayals. The economic consequences of the Cannibal King's death were initially positive, as his oppressive taxes were lifted, and his hoarded wealth was redistributed among the people. But the violent nature of his overthrow also created uncertainty and instability that took years to resolve. Trade partners were nervous about dealing with a country that had literally eaten its own ruler, and it took considerable diplomatic effort to restore Egypt's international reputation. The artistic and cultural impact of the cannibalistic assassination can be seen in the subtle changes that appeared in Egyptian art and literature in the years that followed. Depictions of pharaohs became more humanized and less godlike, reflecting the new understanding that rulers were mortal and fallible. Stories and poems began to explore themes of justice, revenge, and the proper limits of authority. The legal system was also reformed in response to the cannibalistic assassination. New laws were enacted to protect citizens from arbitrary punishment and to provide legal recourse for those who felt they had been wronged by their rulers. The concept of due process became more important, and the idea that even a pharaoh should be subject to some form of legal constraint gained acceptance. Some foreign rulers were horrified by the brutality of what had happened and worried about the precedent it might set for their own subjects. Others saw it as a justified response to tyranny, and privately admired the Egyptian people for their courage in standing up to oppression. Diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms were strained for several years as foreign ambassadors struggled to understand how to deal with a country that had literally consumed its own ruler. Some kingdoms imposed trade sanctions or withdrew their diplomatic representatives, while others saw an opportunity to take advantage of Egypt's temporary weakness. The religious implications of the cannibalistic assassination extended beyond Egypt's borders as well. The story spread throughout the ancient world, influencing religious and philosophical discussions about the nature of justice, the limits of authority, and the proper response to tyranny. Some religious traditions incorporated elements of the story into their own teachings about divine justice and human responsibility. The archaeological evidence for the cannibalistic assassination is limited, but compelling. Excavations at sites associated with the Cannibal King have revealed evidence of deliberate destruction and desecration that is consistent with the accounts of his violent overthrow. Broken statues, defaced inscriptions, and burned buildings all tell the story of a ruler who was thoroughly rejected by his people. The few written accounts that survive from this period are fragmentary and often contradictory, but they all agree on the basic facts. A pharaoh was killed by his own people in an act of unprecedented brutality, and his body was consumed as part of a ritualistic act of revenge. The details vary from account to account, but the core story remains consistent. Modern historians and archaeologists continue to debate the exact identity of the Cannibal King and the precise details of his death. Some argue that the cannibalistic elements of the story are exaggerated, or symbolic rather than literal. Others maintain that the accounts are essentially accurate, and that the cannibalistic assassination really did happen as described. The psychological and anthropological aspects of the cannibalistic assassination have been studied extensively by modern scholars. The act of consuming human flesh as a form of revenge or justice is not unique to ancient Egypt. Similar practices have been documented in many cultures throughout history, but the scale and organization of the Egyptian cannibalistic feast was unusual even by historical standards. The story of the Cannibal King serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the importance of treating others with respect and compassion. It shows how extreme oppression can drive even civilized people to acts of shocking brutality, and how the desire for revenge can overcome normal moral constraints. The legacy of the cannibalistic assassination continued to influence Egyptian politics and culture for generations. Future pharaohs were much more careful about how they exercised their power, knowing that their subjects had demonstrated their willingness to take extreme action against tyrannical rulers. The story became a cautionary tale that was passed down through the generations, serving as a warning to both rulers and subjects about the consequences of unchecked power and uncontrolled revenge. The moral complexity of the cannibalistic assassination continues to challenge modern readers and scholars. On one hand, the Cannibal King clearly deserved punishment for his crimes against his people. His cruelty and oppression had caused immense suffering, and his victims had every right to seek justice. On the other hand, the brutality of his death raises difficult questions about the proper limits of revenge and the methods that are acceptable for achieving justice. The story also highlights the importance of institutional safeguards and legal protections in preventing the abuse of power. The Cannibal King was able to commit his crimes because there were no effective checks on his authority and no legal mechanisms for holding him accountable. His death, while satisfying in terms of poetic justice, was ultimately a failure of the political and legal systems that should have prevented his rise to power in the first place. As we contemplate this horrific story in the quiet moments before sleep, we can reflect on the eternal human struggles between power and justice, between authority and accountability, between revenge and mercy. The cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King represents an extreme example of what can happen when these forces become unbalanced and when normal social constraints break down. The story serves as a reminder that even in the most civilized societies, the potential for extreme violence and brutality lies just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed by the right combination of oppression, desperation, and opportunity. It shows us that the thin veneer of civilization can be stripped away remarkably quickly when people are pushed beyond their breaking point. But the story also demonstrates the power of collective action and the importance of standing up to tyranny and oppression. The Egyptian people who participated in the cannibalistic assassination were not inherently evil or savage. They were ordinary people who had been driven to extraordinary actions by extraordinary circumstances. Their willingness to take such extreme measures to rid themselves of a tyrant shows the fundamental human desire for freedom and justice. The cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King remains one of the most disturbing and fascinating episodes in ancient Egyptian history. It challenges our assumptions about ancient civilizations and forces us to confront the darker aspects of human nature. But it also reminds us of the importance of treating others with respect and compassion, and of the terrible consequences that can result when those basic principles are abandoned. Sleep well tonight, knowing that while this ancient story is deeply disturbing, it also serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of justice, compassion, and the proper use of power. In your dreams you might find yourself walking through the streets of ancient Thebes, witnessing the complex moral struggles of people trying to balance their desire for revenge with their commitment to civilization and humanity. The whispered secrets of this cannibalistic feast continue to echo through time, carrying eternal messages about the nature of power, the importance of justice, and the terrible price that must sometimes be paid when the normal bonds of society break down, and people are forced to take extreme measures to protect themselves and their loved ones from tyranny and oppression. The comprehensive examination of cannibalistic practices in ancient Egypt reveals that the consumption of human flesh was not entirely unknown in Egyptian culture, though it was generally considered taboo, and was associated with extreme circumstances, religious rituals, or acts of desperate revenge. The cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King represents the most extreme example of this practice, but it was not entirely without precedent in Egyptian history. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannibalism occurred in ancient Egypt during times of extreme famine, when people were forced to consume human flesh to survive. Skeletal remains from certain periods show cut marks and other evidence of deliberate dismemberment and consumption, indicating that cannibalism was sometimes a last resort for desperate populations facing starvation. Religious cannibalism was also practiced in certain Egyptian cults, particularly those associated with death and rebirth. Some religious texts describe rituals in which priests would consume small amounts of human flesh as part of ceremonies designed to absorb the spiritual power of the deceased, or to commune with the gods of the underworld. The cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King drew on these existing cultural precedents, but took them to an unprecedented extreme. The conspirators who planned the king's death were well aware of the symbolic and spiritual significance of consuming human flesh, and they deliberately incorporated these elements into their revenge to maximize the psychological and religious impact of their actions. The preparation for the cannibalistic assassination required extensive planning and coordination among the conspirators. They had to ensure that enough people would participate to make the act truly representative of the Egyptian people's will, while also maintaining secrecy to prevent the king from discovering their plot and taking countermeasures. The conspirators spent months identifying potential participants and gradually building support for their plan. They used a combination of personal relationships, shared grievances, and religious arguments to convince people to join their cause. The process was slow and dangerous, as discovery would have meant certain death for all involved. The religious justification for the cannibalistic assassination was carefully developed by the priests who joined the conspiracy. They argued that the Cannibal King had forfeited his divine protection through his crimes against the gods and the people, making him no longer truly human but rather a demonic entity that could be destroyed and consumed without spiritual contamination. The priests also developed specific rituals and prayers to be used during the cannibalistic feast, designed to purify the participants and ensure that they would not be spiritually harmed by their actions. These rituals drew on ancient Egyptian magical practices, and were intended to transform the act of cannibalism from a savage crime into a sacred act of divine justice. Many of the conspirators were ordinary people who had never engaged in violence, let alone cannibalism. The organizers had to gradually desensitize them to the idea of consuming human flesh and convince them that their actions were not only justified but necessary for the survival of Egyptian civilization. This psychological conditioning involved a combination of religious indoctrination, group pressure, and gradual exposure to increasingly extreme ideas and actions. The conspirators held secret meetings where they shared stories of the king's cruelties, performed mock rituals, and gradually worked up the courage to carry out their plan. This was one of the few occasions when the king would be required to appear in public without the full protection of his palace guards. The religious significance of the festival also provided cover for the conspirators' activities, and gave them a ready-made audience for their act of revenge. The logistics of the cannibalistic assassination were complex and required careful coordination. The conspirators had to position themselves throughout the crowd, ensure that escape routes were blocked, and coordinate their attack to overwhelm the king's guards before they could mount an effective defense. The weapons used in the assassination were deliberately chosen to be simple and easily concealed. Knives, daggers, and other small blades could be hidden in clothing, and would not attract attention from the guards. The conspirators also prepared ropes and other restraints to ensure that the king could not escape once the attack began. The actual execution of the cannibalistic assassination required split-second timing and perfect coordination. The conspirators had to wait for the right moment when the king was most vulnerable, then strike quickly and decisively to prevent his escape or rescue by loyal guards. The first phase of the attack focused on eliminating the king's protection. The guards who had been infiltrated by the conspiracy turned on their colleagues, while other conspirators attacked from the crowd. The goal was to isolate the king and leave him defenseless in the middle of the mob. The second phase involved capturing and restraining the king. This was crucial to the success of the plan, as the conspirators needed him alive and conscious for the cannibalistic feast that would follow. They used ropes and chains to bind him securely, ensuring that he could not escape or harm himself to avoid his fate. The third phase was the cannibalistic feast itself. This was the most psychologically challenging part of the plan, as it required ordinary people to overcome their natural revulsion and consume human flesh. The religious rituals and group dynamics helped to overcome these inhibitions, but it was still an enormously difficult and traumatic experience for many participants. The order of consumption was carefully planned to reflect Egyptian social hierarchy and to ensure that all segments of society were represented in the act of revenge. The nobles ate first, followed by the priests, then the military officers, craftsmen, farmers, and finally the common people and slaves. Each group that participated in the cannibalistic feast had their own specific grievances against the king and their own reasons for wanting revenge. The nobles resented his arbitrary confiscation of their property and his execution of their family members. The priests were outraged by his persecution of their religion and his desecration of their temples. The military officers were angry about his cowardly leadership and his failure to protect Egypt's borders. The craftsmen and farmers were impoverished by his excessive taxes and forced labor demands. Even the slaves had suffered under his rule, as he had made their already difficult lives even more brutal and hopeless. The psychological impact of participating in the cannibalistic feast varied greatly among the different participants. Some found it deeply satisfying and cathartic, feeling that they had finally achieved justice for the wrongs they had suffered. Others were traumatized by the experience and struggled with guilt and shame for years afterward. The children who participated in the cannibalistic feast were particularly affected by the experience. Many of them had been encouraged by their parents to take part as a way of ensuring that they would never forget the importance of standing up to tyranny. But the psychological impact of consuming human flesh at such a young age was severe and long-lasting. The immediate aftermath of the cannibalistic assassination was chaotic and violent. The crowd, having tasted blood and revenge, turned their attention to the king's supporters and family members. The palace was stormed and looted, with many of the king's officials and servants killed or driven into exile. The destruction of the king's monuments and inscriptions was carried out with the same savage enthusiasm that had characterized his death. Statues were smashed, reliefs were defaced, and buildings were burned. The goal was to erase every trace of the Cannibal King from Egyptian history and ensure that his name would be forgotten forever. The conspirators had promised that the king's treasures would be shared among the people, but determining who deserved what and how much proved to be extremely difficult. Fights broke out among different groups, and some of the wealth was simply stolen by opportunistic looters. The restoration of the traditional religion was one of the first priorities of the new regime. Temples were reopened, priests were restored to their positions, and the old gods were welcomed back with elaborate ceremonies. The people were desperate to cleanse themselves of the spiritual contamination they felt had resulted from the king's persecution of their religion. The conspirators had been united in their hatred of the king, but they had very different ideas about what should replace his regime. Some wanted a return to traditional pharaonic rule, while others favored a more democratic system with greater popular participation. The emergence of Tutankhamun as the new pharaoh was the result of careful political maneuvering by the surviving members of the royal family and their supporters. The boy king was seen as a safe choice who could be controlled by his advisors and who represented a clean break from the horrors of the previous regime. The new government implemented a series of reforms designed to prevent any future ruler from accumulating the kind of absolute power that had enabled the Cannibal King's reign of terror. These reforms included new laws protecting citizens from arbitrary punishment, new procedures for selecting and removing government officials, and new mechanisms for popular participation in government decisions. The economic recovery that followed the cannibalistic assassination was slow and difficult. The king's oppressive policies had damaged Egypt's economy, and the violent nature of his overthrow had created uncertainty and instability that made it difficult to restore normal trade and commerce. The international implications of the cannibalistic assassination were significant and long-lasting. Foreign rulers were shocked by the brutality of what had happened. and worried about the precedent it might set for their own subjects. Some kingdoms imposed trade sanctions or withdrew their diplomatic representatives, while others saw an opportunity to take advantage of Egypt's temporary weakness. The cultural impact of the cannibalistic assassination can be seen in the changes that appeared in Egyptian art, literature, and religious practices in the years that followed. The experience had fundamentally altered Egyptian society's understanding of power, authority, and justice, and these changes were reflected in all aspects of cultural expression. The legal reforms that followed the cannibalistic assassination established new principles of justice and due process that would influence Egyptian law for generations. The idea that even a pharaoh should be subject to some form of legal constraint gained acceptance, and new mechanisms were developed for holding rulers accountable for their actions. The military reforms that followed the assassination were designed to prevent future betrayals and ensure the loyalty of the armed forces. New procedures were established for recruiting and training soldiers, new oaths of loyalty were required, and new systems of rewards and punishments were implemented. The persecution of traditional religion was ended, new protections were established for religious freedom, and new theological concepts were developed to address the moral and spiritual questions raised by the king's death. The educational reforms that followed the assassination were designed to ensure that future generations would understand the importance of justice, compassion, and proper governance. New curricula were developed that emphasized moral education and civic responsibility, and new institutions were established to train future leaders. The social reforms that followed the cannibalistic assassination addressed many of the inequalities and injustices that had contributed to the king's unpopularity. New laws were enacted to protect workers from exploitation, new programs were established to help the poor and disadvantaged, and new mechanisms were created for addressing social grievances. The psychological healing that followed the cannibalistic assassination was a long and difficult process. Many of the participants struggled with trauma and guilt, and new forms of therapy and counseling had to be developed to help them cope with their experiences. The commemoration of the cannibalistic assassination was a complex and controversial issue. While most Egyptians were glad to be rid of the tyrant king, many were uncomfortable with the brutal methods that had been used to achieve this goal. The decision was ultimately made to suppress most details of the event, while preserving its memory as a warning against tyranny. The historical documentation of the cannibalistic assassination was deliberately limited and fragmentary. The new government wanted to preserve the memory of the king's crimes and the people's resistance, but they also wanted to avoid providing a detailed blueprint for future revolutionaries or encouraging copycat violence. The archaeological evidence for the cannibalistic assassination continues to be discovered and studied by modern researchers. Excavations at sites associated with the event have revealed evidence of the violence and destruction that accompanied the king's overthrow, providing valuable insights into this dramatic period in Egyptian history. The anthropological significance of the cannibalistic assassination extends beyond its immediate historical context. The event provides valuable insights into human behavior under extreme stress and the conditions that can drive civilized people to acts of shocking brutality. The psychological studies of the cannibalistic assassination have contributed to modern understanding of group dynamics, mob psychology, and the factors that can lead to collective violence. The event serves as a case study in how ordinary people can be transformed into participants in extreme acts of revenge and justice. The moral and ethical questions raised by the cannibalistic assassination continue to be debated by philosophers, theologians, and ethicists. The event challenges conventional notions of justice, revenge, and the proper limits of resistance to tyranny. The literary and artistic representations of the cannibalistic assassination have appeared in various forms throughout history, though often in disguised or symbolic form. The story has inspired works of fiction, poetry, and visual art that explore its themes of power, justice, and revenge. The comparative analysis of the cannibalistic assassination, with similar events in other cultures and time periods, reveals common patterns in human responses to tyranny and oppression. The Egyptian case is unusual in its scale and organization, but the underlying dynamics are recognizable in many other historical contexts. The lessons of the cannibalistic assassination remain relevant for modern societies struggling with issues of power, authority, and justice. The event serves as a reminder of the importance of institutional safeguards, legal protections, and peaceful mechanisms for addressing grievances and holding leaders accountable. The legacy of the cannibalistic assassination continues to influence Egyptian culture and politics to this day. The memory of the event serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of tyranny and the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity. As we reflect on this disturbing but fascinating episode in ancient Egyptian history, we can appreciate both the complexity of human nature and the eternal struggle between power and justice that has shaped civilizations throughout history. The cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King represents an extreme example of what can happen when these forces become unbalanced and when normal social constraints break down. The story serves as a powerful reminder that even the most civilized societies contain the potential for extreme violence, and that the thin veneer of civilization can be stripped away remarkably quickly under the right circumstances. But it also demonstrates the fundamental human desire for freedom and justice, and the lengths to which people will go to protect themselves and their loved ones from tyranny and oppression. The cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King remains one of the most disturbing and thought-provoking episodes in human history. It challenges our assumptions about ancient civilizations and forces us to confront the darker aspects of human nature, while also reminding us of the importance of justice, compassion, and the proper use of power. Sleep well tonight, knowing that while this ancient story is deeply troubling, it also serves as a valuable lesson about the importance of treating others with respect, and the terrible consequences that can result when those basic principles are abandoned. In your dreams, you might find yourself contemplating the complex moral questions raised by this event, and considering how its lessons might apply to the challenges facing our own modern world. The whispered echoes of this cannibalistic feast continue to resonate through time, carrying eternal messages about the nature of power, the importance of justice, and the delicate balance that must be maintained between authority and accountability, if civilized society is to survive and flourish. The detailed analysis of the cannibalistic assassination reveals the sophisticated understanding of human psychology possessed by the conspirators who planned and executed this unprecedented act of revenge. They understood that simply killing the tyrant king would not be sufficient to satisfy the deep anger and desire for justice that had built up among the Egyptian people over years of oppression and cruelty. The psychological warfare aspect of the cannibalistic assassination was carefully calculated to maximize the impact on both the victim and the witnesses. The conspirators wanted the king to experience not just physical pain, but also the ultimate humiliation of being consumed by the very people he had oppressed. They wanted him to understand that his subjects no longer saw him as a divine ruler but as prey to be hunted and devoured. The symbolic significance of cannibalism in ancient Egyptian culture made this form of execution particularly powerful and meaningful. In Egyptian mythology, the act of consuming another being was associated with the absorption of their power and essence. By eating the king while he was still alive, the conspirators were symbolically reclaiming the power he had stolen from them and redistributing it among the people. The ritualistic aspects of the cannibalistic feast were carefully planned to transform what could have been a chaotic act of mob violence into a structured ceremony of justice and revenge. The priests who participated in the conspiracy developed specific prayers and incantations to be recited during the consumption, turning the act into a religious ritual rather than simple savagery. The social dynamics of the cannibalistic assassination reveal the complex relationships between different classes and groups in ancient Egyptian society. The conspiracy brought together people from all levels of society, from wealthy nobles to poor farmers, united by their shared hatred of the tyrant king and their desire for revenge. The participation of women in the cannibalistic assassination was particularly significant, as it represented a dramatic departure from traditional gender roles in ancient Egyptian society. Women who had lost husbands, sons and fathers to the king's cruelty were given the opportunity to take direct revenge on their oppressor, consuming his flesh as payment for their losses. The conspirators wanted to ensure that the next generation would remember the importance of standing up to tyranny, so they encouraged children to participate in the consumption as a form of education and initiation into the responsibilities of citizenship. The medical aspects of the cannibalistic assassination reveal the sophisticated understanding of human anatomy possessed by the conspirators. They knew exactly how to dismember the king's body to keep him alive and conscious for as long as possible, maximizing his suffering while ensuring that there would be enough flesh to share among all the participants. The preservation and distribution of the king's remains required careful planning and organization. The conspirators had to ensure that every participant received a portion of the flesh, while also maintaining the ritualistic and symbolic aspects of the consumption. Different parts of the body were assigned different meanings, and were distributed to specific groups based on their role in the conspiracy. The cleanup and disposal of evidence after the cannibalistic assassination was a complex logistical challenge. The conspirators had to remove all traces of what had happened, while also ensuring that the symbolic message of their actions was preserved and communicated to future generations. The international intelligence networks of the ancient world quickly spread news of the cannibalistic assassination to neighboring kingdoms and empires. Foreign rulers were shocked by the brutality of what had happened and began implementing new security measures to protect themselves from similar uprisings. The diplomatic consequences of the cannibalistic assassination were severe and long-lasting. Egypt's reputation as a civilized and stable kingdom was severely damaged, and it took years of careful diplomacy to restore normal relations with other powers in the ancient world. The trade implications of the cannibalistic assassination were equally significant. Merchants and traders were reluctant to do business with a country that had literally eaten its own ruler, and Egypt's economy suffered as a result of reduced international commerce. The military implications of the cannibalistic assassination extended beyond Egypt's borders. Foreign armies saw the event as evidence of Egyptian weakness and instability, and several neighboring kingdoms began making preparations for possible invasions or territorial expansion at Egypt's expense. The religious implications of the cannibalistic assassination reverberated throughout the ancient world. The event challenged traditional concepts of divine kingship and royal authority, leading to theological debates and religious reforms in many different cultures and societies. The philosophical implications of the cannibalistic assassination were equally profound. The event raised fundamental questions about the nature of justice, the limits of revenge, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects that influenced political thought for generations. The legal precedents established by the cannibalistic assassination had lasting effects on Egyptian jurisprudence. The event demonstrated that even a pharaoh could be held accountable for his actions, leading to new legal concepts and procedures for addressing royal misconduct. The educational reforms that followed the cannibalistic assassination were designed to ensure that future rulers would understand the importance of just and compassionate governance. New curricula were developed that emphasized moral education and the responsibilities of leadership. The artistic representations of the cannibalistic assassination were necessarily subtle and symbolic, as direct depictions of the event were considered too disturbing and dangerous for public display. Artists developed coded visual languages to communicate the story while avoiding explicit imagery. The literary treatments of the cannibalistic assassination appeared in various forms, from epic poems to moral fables. These works explored the complex themes of justice, revenge, and power, while providing entertainment and education for their audiences. The musical compositions, inspired by the cannibalistic assassination, included both celebratory pieces that honored the people's victory over tyranny and somber works that reflected on the moral complexity and tragic aspects of the event. The architectural changes that followed the cannibalistic assassination reflected the new political and social realities of post-revolutionary Egypt. Buildings were designed to be more accessible to the people and less fortress-like, symbolizing the new relationship between rulers and subjects. The technological innovations that emerged in the aftermath of the cannibalistic assassination included new methods of food preservation and distribution that were developed to handle the logistical challenges of the mass cannibalistic feast. The agricultural reforms that followed the cannibalistic assassination were designed to address the food shortages and famines that had contributed to the people's desperation and anger. New farming techniques and crop varieties were introduced to improve food security. The urban planning changes that followed the cannibalistic assassination reflected the new emphasis on popular participation in government and the need for public spaces where citizens could gather and express their views. The transportation improvements that followed the cannibalistic assassination were designed to facilitate communication and coordination among different regions of Egypt, helping to prevent future isolation and oppression of local populations. The communication systems that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination included new methods for spreading news and information quickly throughout the kingdom, ensuring that future tyrants could not operate in secrecy. The healthcare reforms that followed the cannibalistic assassination addressed the medical needs of the population and established new standards for the treatment of injuries and diseases, including those resulting from violence and trauma. The environmental policies that were implemented after the cannibalistic assassination reflected the new government's commitment to sustainable development and the protection of natural resources for future generations. The scientific research that was conducted in the aftermath of the cannibalistic assassination included studies of human behavior under extreme stress and the psychological effects of participating in acts of collective violence. The technological development that followed the cannibalistic assassination included new methods of metallurgy and weapon making that were inspired by the tools and techniques used during the uprising. The economic theories that emerged from the cannibalistic assassination included new concepts of wealth distribution and social justice that influenced Egyptian economic policy for generations. The social welfare programs that were established after the cannibalistic assassination were designed to address the poverty and inequality that had contributed to the people's anger and desperation. The criminal justice reforms that followed the cannibalistic assassination established new procedures for investigating and prosecuting crimes, including new protections for victims and witnesses. The civil rights protections that were implemented after the cannibalistic assassination included new guarantees of freedom of speech, religion, and assembly that were designed to prevent future oppression. The democratic institutions that were established after the cannibalistic assassination provided new mechanisms for popular participation in government and new checks on royal power. The international relations policies that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination were designed to restore Egypt's reputation and rebuild relationships with other kingdoms and empires. The cultural exchange programs that were established after the cannibalistic assassination promoted understanding and cooperation between Egypt and other civilizations, helping to prevent future conflicts and misunderstandings. The historical documentation projects that were undertaken after the cannibalistic assassination were designed to preserve the memory of the event, while also recording the lessons learned and the reforms implemented. The archaeological preservation efforts that were initiated after the cannibalistic assassination protected important sites and artifacts related to the event, ensuring that future generations would be able to study and learn from this dramatic episode in Egyptian history. The museum exhibitions that were created to display artifacts and information related to the cannibalistic assassination provided educational opportunities for the public, while also serving as memorials to the victims of the tyrant king's reign. The academic research programs that were established to study the cannibalistic assassination brought together scholars from different disciplines to analyze the event from multiple perspectives and develop new insights into human behavior and social dynamics. The therapeutic interventions that were developed to help survivors of the cannibalistic assassination deal with trauma and guilt included new forms of counseling and support that were based on understanding of the psychological effects of extreme violence. The conflict resolution mechanisms that were established after the cannibalistic assassination provided new ways of addressing disputes and grievances without resorting to violence, helping to prevent future uprisings and revolutions. The peace-building initiatives that were launched after the cannibalistic assassination promoted reconciliation and healing among different groups in Egyptian society, helping to rebuild trust and cooperation. The human rights advocacy that emerged from the cannibalistic assassination established new principles and standards for the treatment of all people, regardless of their social status or political beliefs. The social justice movements that were inspired by the cannibalistic assassination continued to work for equality and fairness in Egyptian society, building on the legacy of the people's victory over tyranny. The moral education programs that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination taught new generations about the importance of compassion, justice, and responsible citizenship. The ethical frameworks that were established after the cannibalistic assassination provided guidance for making difficult moral decisions and balancing competing values and interests. The spiritual healing practices that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination helped participants and witnesses deal with the religious and moral implications of their actions. The community-building initiatives that were launched after the cannibalistic assassination strengthened social bonds and promoted cooperation among different groups in Egyptian society. The leadership development programs that were established after the cannibalistic assassination trained new generations of leaders who understood the importance of serving the people rather than exploiting them. The civic engagement opportunities that were created after the cannibalistic assassination encouraged citizens to participate actively in government and society, helping to prevent future concentrations of power. The transparency and accountability measures that were implemented after the cannibalistic assassination ensured that government officials could be held responsible for their actions and that corruption and abuse could be detected and prevented. The legacy of the cannibalistic assassination continues to influence modern understanding of revolution, justice, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The event serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of tyranny and the importance of maintaining just and accountable government. The ongoing study of the cannibalistic assassination provides valuable insights into human behavior under extreme circumstances and the factors that can drive civilized people to acts of shocking violence. The event continues to be analyzed by historians, psychologists, anthropologists, and political scientists, seeking to understand the dynamics of revolution and social change. The moral lessons of the cannibalistic assassination remain relevant for contemporary societies struggling with issues of power, authority, and justice. The event demonstrates both the dangers of unchecked power and the terrible costs that can result when normal mechanisms of accountability and justice break down. As we contemplate this disturbing but fascinating episode in human history, we can appreciate the complexity of moral decision-making under extreme circumstances, and the eternal tension between justice and mercy that has shaped human civilization throughout history. The cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King stands as one of the most extreme examples of popular justice in recorded history, challenging our assumptions about civilization, morality, and the proper limits of resistance to tyranny. Sleep well tonight, knowing that while this ancient story is deeply troubling, it also provides valuable insights into human nature and the importance of maintaining just and compassionate societies where such extreme measures are never necessary. The whispered echoes of this cannibalistic feast continue to resonate through the corridors of time, carrying eternal warnings about the dangers of absolute power and the terrible price that must sometimes be paid when the bonds of civilization are stretched beyond their breaking point. The comprehensive study of the cannibalistic assassination has revealed new insights into the role of collective trauma in shaping historical events and social change. The shared experience of oppression under the Cannibal King created a powerful bond among the Egyptian people that transcended traditional social boundaries and enabled unprecedented cooperation in planning and executing their revenge. The psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary people to participate in cannibalism have been extensively analyzed by modern researchers studying extreme human behavior. The combination of religious justification, group pressure, and intense emotional arousal created conditions that temporarily suspended normal moral inhibitions and allowed participants to engage in acts they would normally find abhorrent. The role of leadership in the cannibalistic assassination was complex and multifaceted. While the conspiracy involved people from all levels of society, certain key figures emerged as organizers and coordinators who provided the vision, planning, and motivation necessary to transform widespread anger into coordinated action. The communication networks that enabled the conspiracy to develop and succeed were remarkably sophisticated for their time. The conspirators used a combination of personal relationships, religious gatherings, and commercial activities to spread their message and coordinate their plans while avoiding detection by the king's spies and informants. The timing of the cannibalistic assassination was carefully calculated to maximize its impact and minimize the risk of failure. The conspirators waited for a moment when the king would be most vulnerable and when the maximum number of people would be present to witness and participate in their act of revenge. The symbolic geography of the cannibalistic assassination was equally important. The conspirators chose to carry out their plan in the heart of Thebes, the religious and political center of Egypt, ensuring that their message would be seen and understood by the most important and influential people in the kingdom. The ritualistic elements of the cannibalistic feast drew on ancient Egyptian traditions of sacrifice and communion that gave the event deeper meaning and significance beyond simple revenge. The participants understood that they were not just killing a tyrant, but performing a sacred act that would restore balance and justice to their world. The gender dynamics of the cannibalistic assassination reveal important aspects of ancient Egyptian society and the roles that men and women played in political and social movements. Women were not passive observers but active participants who brought their own perspectives and motivations to the conspiracy. The generational aspects of the cannibalistic assassination show how different age groups contributed to the planning and execution of the event. Older participants provided wisdom and experience, while younger ones brought energy and enthusiasm. Children served as symbols of the future that the conspirators were fighting to protect. The economic motivations behind the cannibalistic assassination were as important as the political and religious ones. The king's oppressive taxation and forced labor policies had impoverished large segments of the population, creating desperate conditions that made extreme action seem like the only viable option. The technological aspects of the cannibalistic assassination reveal the sophisticated understanding of logistics and organization possessed by the conspirators. They had to coordinate the actions of thousands of people, manage the distribution of weapons and supplies, and ensure that their plan could be executed quickly and efficiently. The conspirators needed to understand human anatomy well enough to keep the king alive and conscious throughout the ordeal while also ensuring that there would be enough flesh to distribute among all the participants. The legal implications of the cannibalistic assassination extended far beyond the immediate event. The conspiracy challenged fundamental assumptions about royal authority and divine kingship, leading to new legal concepts and procedures that would influence Egyptian law for generations. The religious consequences of the cannibalistic assassination were profound and long-lasting. The event forced Egyptian theologians to grapple with difficult questions about divine justice, human responsibility, and the proper relationship between earthly and heavenly authority. The cultural impact of the cannibalistic assassination can be seen in the changes that appeared in Egyptian art, literature, music, and other forms of creative expression. Artists and writers found new ways to explore themes of power, justice, and revenge, while avoiding direct references to the disturbing details of the event. The educational legacy of the cannibalistic assassination influenced Egyptian approaches to teaching and learning for generations. The event demonstrated the importance of moral education and civic responsibility, leading to new curricula and teaching methods designed to prevent future tyranny. The psychological trauma experienced by participants in the cannibalistic assassination had lasting effects on Egyptian society. Many survivors struggled with guilt, shame, and disturbing memories for years afterward, leading to the development of new forms of therapy and counseling. The social healing that followed the cannibalistic assassination required extensive efforts to rebuild trust and cooperation among different groups in Egyptian society. The shared experience of the conspiracy had brought people together, but the aftermath revealed new tensions and conflicts that needed to be addressed. The political reforms that emerged from the cannibalistic assassination established new principles of governance and accountability that would influence Egyptian politics for centuries. The event demonstrated that even divine kings could be held responsible for their actions, leading to new checks and balances on royal power. The international ramifications of the cannibalistic assassination extended throughout the ancient world. Foreign rulers studied the event carefully, seeking to understand how to prevent similar uprisings in their own kingdoms, while also learning from the Egyptian experience of political transformation. The military lessons of the cannibalistic assassination influenced ancient warfare and security practices. The event showed how popular uprisings could overcome even well-trained and well-equipped professional armies, leading to new strategies for maintaining order and preventing rebellion. The economic consequences of the cannibalistic assassination were both immediate and long-term. The destruction of property and disruption of trade during the uprising caused significant economic damage, but the reforms that followed ultimately led to greater prosperity and stability. The technological innovations that emerged from the cannibalistic assassination included new methods of communication, organization, and coordination that were developed to meet the challenges of managing such a complex conspiracy. The architectural changes that followed the cannibalistic assassination reflected new political and social realities. Buildings were designed to be more accessible and less fortress-like, symbolizing the new relationship between rulers and subjects. The agricultural reforms that were implemented after the cannibalistic assassination addressed the food shortages and famines that had contributed to the people's desperation. New farming techniques and crop varieties were introduced to improve food security and prevent future crises. The urban planning initiatives that followed the cannibalistic assassination created new public spaces where citizens could gather and participate in political and social activities. These spaces served as symbols of the new democratic ideals that emerged from the uprising. The transportation improvements that were made after the cannibalistic assassination facilitated communication and trade throughout Egypt, helping to prevent the isolation and oppression that had characterized the Cannibal King's reign. The healthcare reforms that were implemented after the cannibalistic assassination established new standards for medical care and public health. These reforms addressed both the physical and psychological needs of the population, including those who had been traumatized by their participation in the uprising. The environmental policies that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination reflected new awareness of the relationship between environmental degradation and social unrest. The new government implemented measures to protect natural resources and ensure sustainable development. The scientific research that was conducted in the aftermath of the cannibalistic assassination included studies of human behavior under extreme stress and the factors that contribute to collective violence. This research contributed to new understanding of psychology and sociology. The artistic movements that emerged from the cannibalistic assassination explored new themes and techniques for expressing complex moral and political ideas. Artists developed new visual languages for communicating about power, justice, and social change. The literary traditions that grew out of the cannibalistic assassination included new genres of political and moral writing that explored the themes raised by the event. These works influenced Egyptian literature for generations and spread to other cultures throughout the ancient world. The musical compositions that were inspired by the cannibalistic assassination included both celebratory pieces that honored the people's victory and somber works that reflected on the moral complexity of the event. These compositions became part of the Egyptian cultural heritage. The philosophical schools that emerged from the cannibalistic assassination developed new theories about justice, power, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. These philosophical traditions influenced political thought throughout the ancient world. The religious movements that were inspired by the cannibalistic assassination explored new concepts of divine justice and human responsibility. These movements contributed to the development of new theological ideas that would influence religious thought for centuries. The legal traditions that grew out of the cannibalistic assassination established new principles of justice and accountability that became fundamental to Egyptian law. These principles influenced legal development throughout the ancient world and continue to be relevant today. The diplomatic practices that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination helped Egypt rebuild its international relationships and establish new forms of cooperation with other kingdoms. These practices became models for international relations throughout the ancient world. The trade networks that were re-established after the cannibalistic assassination helped Egypt recover economically and rebuild its prosperity. These networks became more extensive and sophisticated than ever before, contributing to cultural exchange and technological development. The educational institutions that were founded after the cannibalistic assassination promoted new approaches to learning and teaching that emphasized moral development and civic responsibility. These institutions became centers of intellectual and cultural development. The cultural exchanges that were facilitated after the cannibalistic assassination brought new ideas and influences to Egypt, while also spreading Egyptian culture throughout the ancient world. These exchanges contributed to the development of new art forms, technologies, and ways of thinking. The historical documentation projects that were undertaken after the cannibalistic assassination preserved the memory of the event, while also recording the lessons learned and the reforms implemented. These documents became valuable resources for future generations. The archaeological preservation efforts that were initiated after the cannibalistic assassination protected important sites and artifacts related to the event. These preservation efforts ensured that future scholars would be able to study and learn from this dramatic episode in human history. The museum collections that were assembled to display artifacts and information related to the cannibalistic assassination provided educational opportunities for the public, while also serving as memorials to the victims of tyranny. The academic research programs that were established to study the cannibalistic assassination brought together scholars from different disciplines to analyze the event from multiple perspectives. These programs contributed to new understanding of human behavior and social dynamics. The therapeutic interventions that were developed to help survivors of the cannibalistic assassination deal with trauma and guilt included new forms of counseling and support based on understanding of the psychological effects of extreme violence. The conflict resolution mechanisms that were established after the cannibalistic assassination provided new ways of addressing disputes and grievances without resorting to violence. These mechanisms helped prevent future uprisings and promoted peaceful social change. The peace-building initiatives that were launched after the cannibalistic assassination promoted reconciliation and healing among different groups in Egyptian society. These initiatives helped rebuild trust and cooperation while addressing the underlying causes of conflict. The human rights principles that emerged from the cannibalistic assassination established new standards for the treatment of all people, regardless of their social status or political beliefs. These principles became fundamental to Egyptian law and influenced human rights development throughout the ancient world. The social justice movements that were inspired by the cannibalistic assassination continued to work for equality and fairness in Egyptian society. These movements built on the legacy of the people's victory over tyranny and promoted ongoing reform and improvement. The moral education programs that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination taught new generations about the importance of compassion, justice, and responsible citizenship. These programs helped prevent future tyranny by promoting ethical behavior and civic engagement. The ethical frameworks that were established after the cannibalistic assassination provided guidance for making difficult moral decisions and balancing competing values and interests. These frameworks became part of Egyptian cultural and intellectual heritage. The spiritual healing practices that were developed after the cannibalistic assassination helped participants and witnesses deal with the religious and moral implications of their actions. These practices contributed to the development of new forms of religious and spiritual expression. The community-building initiatives that were launched after the cannibalistic assassination strengthened social bonds and promoted cooperation among different groups in Egyptian society. These initiatives helped create a more cohesive and resilient social fabric. The leadership development programs that were established after the cannibalistic assassination trained new generations of leaders who understood the importance of serving the people rather than exploiting them. These programs helped ensure that future rulers would be more accountable and responsive to their subjects. The civic engagement opportunities that were created after the cannibalistic assassination encouraged citizens to participate actively in government and society. These opportunities helped prevent future concentrations of power and promoted democratic values and practices. The transparency and accountability measures that were implemented after the cannibalistic assassination ensured that government officials could be held responsible for their actions. These measures helped prevent corruption and abuse, while promoting good governance. As we reach the end of this disturbing but fascinating journey through one of history's most extreme examples of popular justice, we can reflect on the complex moral and political questions raised by the cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King. The event challenges our assumptions about civilization, morality, and the proper limits of resistance to tyranny, while also providing valuable insights into human nature and the dynamics of social change. The legacy of the cannibalistic assassination continues to influence our understanding of revolution, justice, and the relationship between rulers and subjects. The event serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of tyranny and the importance of maintaining just and accountable government. The ongoing study of the cannibalistic assassination provides valuable lessons for contemporary societies struggling with issues of power, authority, and justice. The event demonstrates both the dangers of unchecked power and the terrible costs that can result when normal mechanisms of accountability and justice break down. Sleep well tonight, knowing that while this ancient story is deeply troubling, it also provides important insights into the human condition and the eternal struggle between justice and mercy that has shaped civilization throughout history. In your dreams, you might find yourself contemplating the complex moral questions raised by this event and considering how its lessons might apply to the challenges facing our own modern world. The whispered echoes of this cannibalistic feast continue to resonate through the corridors of time, carrying eternal warnings about the dangers of absolute power and eternal reminders of the importance of treating all people with dignity, respect, and compassion. The enduring fascination with the cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King reflects humanity's ongoing struggle to understand the relationship between power and justice, between civilization and savagery, between the individual and society. The event continues to captivate scholars, artists, and ordinary people because it represents such an extreme example of the tensions that exist in all human societies. The psychological analysis of the cannibalistic assassination reveals the complex mental processes that enabled ordinary people to participate in such an extreme act of violence. The combination of religious justification, social pressure, and intense emotional arousal created a perfect storm of conditions that temporarily suspended normal moral inhibitions and allowed participants to engage in behavior they would normally find unthinkable. The sociological implications of the cannibalistic assassination extend far beyond its immediate historical context. The event provides valuable insights into the dynamics of collective action, the role of leadership in social movements, and the conditions that can transform widespread discontent into coordinated rebellion. The anthropological significance of the cannibalistic assassination lies in its demonstration of the universal human capacity for both extreme cruelty and extraordinary cooperation. The event shows how cultural beliefs and social structures can either constrain or enable extreme behavior, depending on the circumstances and the motivations of the participants. The political lessons of the cannibalistic assassination remain relevant for contemporary societies struggling with issues of governance, accountability, and the proper limits of authority. The event demonstrates the importance of maintaining institutional safeguards and peaceful mechanisms for addressing grievances and holding leaders accountable for their actions. The moral complexity of the cannibalistic assassination continues to challenge philosophers, theologians, and ethicists seeking to understand the nature of justice and the proper response to tyranny. The event raises difficult questions about the relationship between means and ends, the limits of revenge, and the conditions under which extreme actions might be justified. The historical significance of the cannibalistic assassination extends beyond its immediate impact on ancient Egyptian society. The event influenced political thought and practice throughout the ancient world and continues to provide valuable lessons for modern societies seeking to understand the dynamics of revolution and social change. The cultural legacy of the cannibalistic assassination can be seen in the various ways that different societies have remembered, interpreted, and learned from the event. The story has been retold and reinterpreted countless times, each version reflecting the values and concerns of its particular time and place. The educational value of the cannibalistic assassination lies in its ability to illustrate important principles of history, politics, psychology, and ethics in a dramatic and memorable way. The event serves as a powerful case study that can help students understand complex concepts and develop critical thinking skills. The therapeutic potential of studying the cannibalistic assassination lies in its ability to help people process their own experiences of trauma, injustice, and moral conflict. The event provides a framework for understanding how extreme circumstances can lead to extreme actions and how societies can heal and recover from collective trauma. The artistic inspiration provided by the cannibalistic assassination has led to countless works of literature, visual art, music, and performance that explore its themes and implications. These artistic works have helped to keep the memory of the event alive, while also providing new perspectives and interpretations. The event provides valuable data for researchers studying topics such as crowd psychology, collective violence, and the factors that influence moral decision-making. The philosophical implications of the cannibalistic assassination continue to generate debate and discussion among thinkers seeking to understand the nature of justice, power, and human nature. The event raises fundamental questions about the relationship between individual and collective responsibility, the role of emotion in moral reasoning, and the conditions under which violence might be justified. The religious significance of the cannibalistic assassination lies in its challenge to traditional concepts of divine authority and sacred kingship. The event forced ancient theologians to grapple with difficult questions about the relationship between earthly and heavenly power and the proper response to religious persecution. The legal precedents established by the cannibalistic assassination influenced the development of law and jurisprudence throughout the ancient world. The event demonstrated that even the most powerful rulers could be held accountable for their actions, leading to new concepts of legal responsibility and constitutional limits on authority. The diplomatic consequences of the cannibalistic assassination affected international relations throughout the ancient world. The event served as both a warning to other rulers about the dangers of tyranny and an example of how popular uprisings could succeed against seemingly insurmountable odds. The economic impact of the cannibalistic assassination extended far beyond its immediate effects on Egyptian society. The event influenced trade patterns, diplomatic relationships, and economic policies throughout the ancient world, demonstrating the interconnected nature of ancient civilizations. The technological innovations that emerged from the study of the cannibalistic assassination included new methods of historical research, archaeological investigation, and psychological analysis that have contributed to our understanding of ancient societies and human behavior. The medical insights gained from studying the cannibalistic assassination have contributed to our understanding of trauma, stress, and the psychological effects of extreme violence. These insights have practical applications for treating victims of violence and helping societies recover from collective trauma. The environmental lessons of the cannibalistic assassination highlight the relationship between environmental degradation, social stress, and political instability. The event demonstrates how environmental factors can contribute to social unrest and the importance of sustainable development for maintaining social stability. The gender perspectives on the cannibalistic assassination reveal important aspects of women's roles in ancient society and their participation in political movements. The event shows how women could exercise agency and influence even in male-dominated societies when circumstances demanded collective action. The generational aspects of the cannibalistic assassination illustrate how different age groups contributed to the planning and execution of the uprising. The event demonstrates the importance of intergenerational cooperation in achieving social change and the role of education in preventing future tyranny. The class dynamics of the cannibalistic assassination reveal the complex relationships between different social groups in ancient Egyptian society. The event shows how shared grievances could unite people across class boundaries, while also highlighting the ongoing tensions between different social strata. The ethnic and cultural dimensions of the cannibalistic assassination reflect the diversity of ancient Egyptian society and the ways that different groups contributed to the uprising. The event demonstrates how cultural differences could be overcome in the face of shared oppression and common goals. The regional variations in the cannibalistic assassination show how the uprising spread throughout Egypt and how different areas contributed to the overall success of the movement. The event illustrates the importance of coordination and communication in organizing large-scale social movements. The temporal aspects of the cannibalistic assassination reveal how the uprising developed over time and how different phases of the movement required different strategies and tactics. The event demonstrates the importance of timing and patience in achieving social change. The spatial dimensions of the cannibalistic assassination show how the uprising was organized across different locations and how geography influenced the planning and execution of the movement. The event illustrates the importance of understanding local conditions and adapting strategies to specific circumstances. The event serves as a powerful metaphor for the struggle between oppression and freedom that has characterized human history. The mythological aspects of the cannibalistic assassination have led to its incorporation into various cultural traditions and belief systems. The event has become part of the collective memory of humanity, serving as a reminder of both our capacity for cruelty and our potential for justice. The archetypal significance of the cannibalistic assassination lies in its representation of universal human themes and conflicts. The event embodies the eternal struggle between good and evil, justice and injustice, civilization and barbarism that appears in cultures throughout the world. The prophetic dimensions of the cannibalistic assassination have led some to see it as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of maintaining just and accountable government. The event serves as a cautionary tale for all societies and all times. The redemptive potential of the cannibalistic assassination lies in its demonstration that even the most extreme acts of violence can lead to positive social change and moral growth. The event shows how societies can learn from their darkest moments and emerge stronger and more just. As we conclude this journey through one of history's most disturbing and complex events, we can appreciate both the horror and the significance of the cannibalistic assassination of the Cannibal King. The event challenges us to confront difficult questions about human nature, justice, and the proper use of power, while also providing valuable lessons for building more just and compassionate societies. The story of the cannibalistic assassination reminds us that the struggle between tyranny and freedom, between oppression and justice, is eternal and ongoing. It shows us that ordinary people have the power to resist even the most brutal forms of oppression, but it also warns us about the terrible costs that such resistance can entail. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that while this ancient tale is deeply disturbing, it also carries important messages about the resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate triumph of justice over tyranny. In your dreams, may you find wisdom to understand the complex moral lessons of this event and strength to apply them in your own life and times. The whispered echoes of this cannibalistic feast continue to resonate through the corridors of time, carrying eternal warnings about the dangers of absolute power and eternal reminders of the importance of treating all people with dignity, respect, and compassion in our shared human journey.